when you, having done so much research and thought about the world in so much detail, when you look around the world at the moment, what do you see?
I want to be candid about these things. I don't like false pretense. I had to make a decision at some point in my life. Am I going to be a grand theorist, or am I going to focus on one fairly narrow area, learn it, master it, perfect my understanding of it?
And what was the area that you decided to drill down?
Completely by happenstance. Most of my youth was spent in issues like Vietnam War, Civil Rights Movement, the farm workers who were organizing in our country, Cesar Chavez, the UFW, United Farm Workers. And then at a pretty late age, age 29, when Israel invaded Lebanon, I became involved. The invasion lasted much longer than Israel's recent massacres. It started in early June and it ended in September during what was called the Sabra and Shatila massacre. And I got involved. Then, because the group I was involved with was a group of Jews who were opposed to the Israeli invasion, I then proceeded to study the topic because there was a whole issue about where you stood in Zionism, and for various personal reasons, I wasn't prepared to make an intellectual commitment one way or the other until I studied it closely. It eventually became my doctoral dissertation, and now there was an intellectual interest in the subject, there was a political interest in the subject, and there was a personal interest in the subject.
Why?
Because both my parents were survivors of the Nazi Holocaust. Both my mother and father were in the Warsaw Ghetto from 1940 to 1943, when the ghetto uprising was repressed. The survivors, about 20 or 30,000, they were deported to Majdanek concentration camp. Both of my parents were among those deported. My father ended up in Auschwitz, and on the Auschwitz death march, my mother ended up in 2 slave labor camps. And every single member of the family on both sides, bar none, every single member was exterminated. As my mother used to say when we were growing up, we are 5 people in the world. Myself, my 2 siblings, my mother, and my father. And that was it. And the Nazi Holocaust was constantly being used, I would say exploited, in order to justify Israeli actions. You know, people think I have some sort of obsession with the conflict. Actually, I have none. The problem is it never ended, and it likely won't find any resolution in my lifetime. I don't believe that I can't say to friends I have in the West Bank or in Gaza, well, you know, I got bored, I decided to move on.
It became a bit difficult.
Right. You know, it's like, they don't have that choice. And if they don't have that choice, then I don't have that choice. And so I stuck to it, and it became my life.
Jump from your 29-year-old self to today.
Mm-hmm.
Give us a depiction from your point of view of the Middle East.
You know, when I was a young man, I was a great follower of Mao Zedong. I was what you call a Maoist. And one of his famous statements at the time, in the 70s, he said, quote, "There is great disorder under heaven. This is a good thing." Now, most people react with a certain amount of perplexity at that. How can it be a good thing? But we did think it was a good thing, those of us who, because a stability based on oppression, a stability based on vast inequity in the distribution of wealth, and a stability based on the misery of most people. Most people are living in a miserable circumstance.
Why did you accept this?
Because I was a radical, I was a revolutionary. I wanted to change the world, and I did believe it was possible to make the world a fairer place, a more decent place, a more equitable place. With all due regard to Mao Zedong, there is now a great deal of disorder in the Middle East, and you have to recognize it's not a great thing.
Why did you recognize at the time that it was acceptable that you can have that disorder?
Well, because when we thought about disorder back then, we thought about an organized disorder.
What does that mean, though?
Well, organized disorder means that there were revolutionary, radical movements, which were determined to alter the balance of power and the balance of wealth in the world.
And you were happy with that movement?
Well, no. Obviously, there were a lot of illusions, a lot of myths, delusions, which I have to acknowledge. And it's painful for me to acknowledge, not because I have a problem with acknowledging error. Error is not hard for me to acknowledge. It's a matter of acknowledging a wasted youth, a squandered youth. The only thing I got out of it was negative lessons. Now, negative lessons are good, but it would have been much better if I got positive lessons. In any event, to get back to the point you asked, Libya under Gaddafi was an awful place, for sure. But is the situation that replaced it better? No. There's just great disorder. There's no organized resistance. There's just warlords, complete disorder. Iraq under Saddam Hussein was a terrible place. Was a situation that replaced it for about 10 years better? No. Syria under Assad or Bashar, not a good place. Is what replaced it the past 5 or so years better? No. So there's a point where the great disorder becomes wholly negative. When we thought about disorder back then, we thought about it as a step towards a revolutionary transformation of society. You know, China underwent a great disorder from early part of the 20th century until Mao Zedong came to power. There was a civil war, and it was a brutal civil war. It ended with his ascension to power, which had its good and bad side. I think the balance sheet is positive, but that's a matter of opinion. But the disorder, which now covers virtually the whole of the Middle East, is obviously it's been a complete and total disaster.
Where does this end, if it does end?
Presumably there's going to be consolidations of power at some point in all the places. Will it be positive consolidations of power? Probably not, because, and this is another lesson I learned from the negative lesson, that armed struggle doesn't bring the best people into power. It brings people who are ruthless, who are power hungry, and those types, they don't augur well for the future.
You can't today talk about the Middle East without talking about the US and Britain. What sort of influence have both of those countries and their foreign policies, respectively, what sort of influence have they had on that area?
You have to look at it over a long period. You cannot pretend as if the situation that has befallen the Middle East the past, we'll say, decade, is divorced from the kind of system that was set up by the British when they came to the Middle East. The British moment, as it's called, I think, by the British historian Elizabeth Munro. That moment, it climaxed in the mess that you have now, because they set up all these autocracies, these completely self-serving, corrupt regimes. And the reaction that's set in is a reaction to that long history of British and then American domination of the region, or British, then British and American, and then just American domination of the region. You can't understand Iran without understanding the coup orchestrated by the United States in Iran in 1953. You can't understand Saddam unless you see that the US supported Saddam during the war with Iran from 1980 to 88. So I'm not going to prepare a precise balance sheet and say, well, the British did something, brought schools and da-da-da-da-da. Versus this, I would say, rather than look at a precise balance sheet, I think one has to accept the fact that the climax of that foreign interference, first intervention, then interference, the climax is what we're experiencing right now. This is the result of that whole corrupt system.
Why is it, in your view, that there is a sort of selective amnesia amongst ministers, politicians, and the media, frankly, when it comes to talking contextually about the Middle East in the way that you've just depicted it?
Well, because there's a feeling like we did them a favor and they blew it. So I knew this creepy guy at Princeton. He ended up at Johns Hopkins. His name was Fuad Ajami. He was one of the big supporters of the Iraq War. He was Arab from Lebanon. He wrote a book after the Iraq War debacle. It was called The Foreigner's Gift. And you get the whole idea. In the title, we came in, we ended the tyranny of Saddam Hussein, and then they blew it. And we gave them a gift, and they blew it because Arabs are so incompetent, and Arabs are so stupid, and Arabs are this and that.
And is that a different sort of version of white man's burden, that you have to get involved because actually we've got a moral authority, a moral obligation?
Right, but then the sub-theme is, but we can only do so much.
Right, but that leaves a massive gap for all this absolute disaster to unfold.
Right.
But do we not think about that? Is the hubris so great? Is the arrogance so great?
Yeah, I think the hubris and arrogance are so great that they don't see the responsibility. And they have a whole different sense of what you want, what you desire. These are lesser peoples, and they're basically incompetent, not very bright. And what you want to do is set up some sort of benign dictatorship which looks to the West for its inspiration. So they're not there to set up democratic regimes. Basically, they're there to set up regimes which are enthralled to the West, and then they justify it in their minds on the grounds that, well, that's the best you can hope for from people like that. But they also do believe that these Middle Eastern types or African types, that they're completely incompetent and left to their own devices. Of course, they're going to mess everything up because that's just their nature. That's one of the reasons why, despite everything, I have a soft spot in my heart for Mao. Not because I'm indifferent to the crimes, but because, you know, in my generation and before, China was called the sick man of Asia. There was no China. It was just a sack of potatoes, and all the warlords had divided up, and the foreign powers and the warlords together had divided up. And all the stereotypes you hear about Middle Easterners now, their incompetence, their stupidity, they can't get their act together. You heard the same thing about China. One of the things that Mao did achieve, and I don't think it's any way to deny it, was he restored the dignity of the Chinese people. He was in his own way, you know, he was not in his own way, he was a Chinese nationalist, knew Chinese history very, very well, and he restored the dignity. Now, it was a harsh, you could say brutal, and it was ruthless the way he went about it, but nobody talks about the sick man of Asia anymore.
But are you coming back to saying that actually the ends justify the means? Because it's, I mean, when we're talking about pragmatism, you've just summed it up.
I recognize those as achievements, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. That's why I like Nasrallah, the head of the Hezbollah. Extremely smart guy, very focused, very sharp. He's the only leader in the world who you actually learn things from his speeches. It begins with the Quranic verses and the Quranic allegories, but then around 1/4 of the way through, he starts with the facts and he starts with analysis. And you could see he's a guy who was using his time to educate. And you feel somebody there who has pride in being Arab, pride in being Muslim. I'm not a believer, but I do think there's something to be said at the end of the day about human dignity and being, I don't know if I like the word proud of who you are, but not ashamed of who you are.
Norman Finkelstein, thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you so much for having me.